Hello there. Have you watched the Race World first? Yes? No? But you still want to know what the specs are for rating in terms of their ranking. Where are they situated? Is your spec going to be good? Yeah, the balance is not very good this time around, but it could be because it's the very first weeks, 2 weeks, let's say. We're in the third week as you're watching this, but this is recorded a little bit ahead of time. So it's all to shit. But let's take a look at where everybody is situated this tier. And as always, we are starting with the Frost Death Knight because it just happens to be here. Now, I do have to disclaim it a little bit. For some of these, we don't really have complete data. We can, of course, look at Race World first or watch Max's tier list as well. But those are for very specific players and niche situations and niche guild rosters that are not even conclusive enough with the data available to see exactly how good or how bad that is. So I kind of have to use what we already have and put Frost DK around in C tier. DK in general this year is not that great in terms of the overall performance. There are, of course, damage distributions of specs where you can see where exactly it is situated. It's not too bad in terms of the damage output that it can have. Then it might get buffs there, but that's not all that goes into actually having a good spec for the raid. This is not a damage tier list, by the way, because of course we want to know that the spec that we play does the most damage, but that's not always true. Windwalker essentially is probably one of the best ones, but we'll get to that as well. But it's not always the best spec to have in the raid. And I will go over all of the criteria that goes into ranking some of these specs, whatever they are, because if you don't like it, of course, you can let us know in the comments down below. And you'll at least know why there are in S tier fewer specs than you might expect, and in D tier more specs than you might expect. Oh, I'm gonna get burned! Not unlike how I get burned in bloopers that we normally have available for our patrons. I'm only doing this because our patrons are actually supporting our content quite a bit and we are super grateful for them. And if you want to support your boys a little bit more to do these kind of videos and even more, you can hop onto our patrons and you will have access to some bloopers that we do for our patrons monthly that you might not know go around behind the scenes. And even in this very video, 2 minutes ago, while I was talking to the camera, I fucked it up. Well, let's take a quick look at... It's all the shit. But let's take a quick look. The link to our patreon.com/Marcelian&Online is down below. If you're interested in supporting us, you'll have access to a lot more stuff than just bloopers, by the way. Plus, you'll be helping us out to do more content in the future, and it's greatly appreciated. Thank you very much. Now, we're gonna hop into Unholy, a stark contrast in our tier list. You might not see a lot of people put Unholy so high, but I will put it as high as A tier. In terms of damage, it's okay overall, if we're gonna be looking at how Unholy performs throughout the entirety of this raid. But I do have two main criteria as to why I am putting Unholy so high up in the tier list, and one of them is boss damage, and this is going to be a recurring theme throughout the video. Unholy actually does have a lot of boss damage. Now, we know that this raid primarily is AoE. There are two bosses that are pure single target. So you could say Sprocketmonger and Cauldron are the single target bosses. Literally every other boss has add. Even Mugsy has occasional cleave as well. So it's a pure AoE fight. However, pretty much everybody has some form of cleave, Unholy included as well. But what really matters is that boss damage, because eventually the more gear you put on, the faster these adds will die, the less people will need to actually spec into AoE or cleave of any kind. So boss damage becomes probably the most crucial aspect of the game, which is part of the theme of today's tier list. We're gonna use boss damage as one of the major criteria into ranking these specs, not just overall damage. And before we go into Havoc, the second thing that makes me put Unholy so high is that it has the highest survivability in the game. I think it's kind of tied to Frost DK, because why wouldn't they? And this actually matters. You probably didn't see almost any Death Knights in the Race World first, at least from Liquid to my knowledge. I'm sure some people might have used it. That's fine, because you didn't really need the utility kit of a Death Knight, and its damage wasn't that great either. But it is the tankiest spec/class in the game currently, and that's a factor that you probably won't see in Race World first guilds, where everybody's pretty much playing as perfect as you can play. But whenever shit hits the fan, Death Knight is probably one of the best classes to be, that and some others on the list, but Death Knight for sure, because you just have a lot of immunities, you have some of the strongest defensives and the most defensives in the game, you provide AMZ to your raid, and you're probably going to want that from an Unholy rather than a Frost DK, and people don't value these as much, I would guess, whenever they're ranking Unholy, before, let's say, average Mythic guilds, or Mythic guilds that are still like struggling. Okay, do we need all of the healing in this phase? Do we not need this? That's when, you know, classes like Death Knight become really, really good, because they can just survive through a lot of the stuff and mistakes that guilds go through. Similar to Havoc, although Havoc is not as tanky as Death Knight, it does more damage as Death Knight, and most importantly, it is very mobile. There are a lot of fights where you really need a lot of mobility. Mugsy comes to mind as well, depending on your strategy, of course, where you have to like just zoom around the battlefield from add, past the mines, go do the soak, do all of that stuff, and that's why Windwalker is also such a good spec there, because it's mobile, but Havoc is also a part of that as well. It doesn't have the most amount of damage, it's just a really solid spec. Listen, Havoc might be one of those specs where if you are playing it, you're probably the happiest, most reliable person in the guild, because you don't have enough damage to be nerfed, you don't really need any buffs, you're just really good. As opposed to Balanced Druid. Now, as always, Balanced Druid is a terrible raid spec, and this hasn't changed since its rework. I was confused as to why everybody was putting Balanced Druid highly, and by everybody I mean mostly websites with aggregated data like WarcraftLogs, Arcane.gg, Radar.io. Its AoE is definitely top tier, and if we're looking at, let's say, Styx as the boss, where Balanced Druid is probably the best spec at, where you just have a lot of spread cleave over a large area, that's where Balance is really good. But that's kind of like the only boss Balance is good at, which would kind of be considered the council style boss of the raid, which is not really a council, but it's as close as you'll get. And that's kind of where Balance has excelled over the last, I don't know, 3 expansions almost. Since the last time Balance was really good on single target bosses that I can recall was basically in Shadowlands, when you had Ravenous Frenzy and you can just like missile fire all of those single target star surges. But Balance, unless it's going to get like massively reworked for raids as well, is going to be a terrible raid spec altogether. Most damage that you'll ever see from a Balanced Druid is going to be pure AoE. And in terms of Druid, it's not that great either. I mean, sure, you want Mark of the Wilds. Not sure if you would want a Resto Druid or a Bear, but if none of those are a good option and you want a Druid for your raid, you definitely need Feral. And this is where I can collectively hear all the meows of the world in approval that Feral is A tier, because this might be the only tier list you will see Feral ranked so high. And I have very good reasons, and I mentioned these with Unholy DK, and I will kind of culminate it, go full circle with Feral. For the last couple of expansions, Feral has been one of the specs with the most amount of boss damage in the game, most efficient boss damage in the game, period. And people usually overlook this factor, especially in raids like this one where you have a lot of AoE, because Feral just doesn't really scale well with raid AoE. It kind of requires a slight ramp. It's not really a ramp, but it's dot damage, right? That's what Feral AoE damage is. It's dot damage and slight cleave from the main target with ramp and ferocity. And that either is really good if everybody's going full single target, or well, really good if the ads last for a very long time, which is not always the case with the exception of Styx, but Balanced Druid just does that better. Outside of that, Feral is just very solid across the board. If you keep looking at all of these data ranking graphs that we have on the screen, just to kind of showcase where Feral is situated when it comes to just doing that damage on bosses. And that's really what matters, because whenever you're getting enough gear on everybody, the ads will just explode, so Feral AoE won't even matter, and a lot of people will just end up padding on damage. This is how Fury Warriors got nerfed last year, and all you're left with once again is that boss damage that's very important, or priority focus damage. Let's say you have some of the ads on Mugsy, let's say you have some of the ads on One Arm Bandit. Those are also very important to get down. Devastation has seen a resurgence to an extent since Augmentation died. Now I'm not sure where to put this right now, because I feel like this is a very good spec and a very good DPS, but everything that I'm seeing right now doesn't really make it shine too much. Now I don't know if it's because because Evoker in general is just not that great for raid anymore, and you're probably going to get your Evoker utility and raid buffs from a Preservation rather than a Devastation, which is kind of sad a little bit if I have to be honest. You could make an argument for Devastation to be B tier in terms of overall performance. Its damage is not particularly that bad, but in a situation where it's also not a very tanky spec, so you don't really want an unreliable spec in terms of survivability. It's mobile, sure, but its range is very awkward to pull off considering like how much mobility you need to go through and how many bombs you need to dodge in this raid. Having to pull that off, I can foresee that might be a little bit difficult and would hinder your DPS performance quite a bit. It's probably why it is in C tier. There are arguments where it could be better. I would actually kind of hope that Devastation would be buffed, because outside of its raw damage output, I don't know if it brings a lot of help to the raid outside of carrying your priests in your lovely lizard arms across the battlefield, because goddamn priests have no mobility. That's as much as I can say about Devastation right now. We just don't have enough data, and personally, we don't really have Devastations in our guild, so I cannot really have first-hand experience of it either. Beast Mastery is a much better situation than Devastation. It's top of the B tier. I debated if I should put this into A tier as well, but nothing really tells me that it's worth its spot in A tier. It has very good damage. I would know, we have a bunch of Beast Masteries in our raid as well, and they do really good damage, but it's nothing extraordinary. It doesn't have like some of the best boss damage or some of the best AoE. It's just very solid, as hunters are always. You might actually need hunters in the raid depending on your strategy in clearing some of the mechanics, one of which would be Mugsy, a difficult boss to clear. And by the way, you're seeing a lot of graphs on the screen right now. They're mostly from heroic bosses, because Mythic is just not there yet, and we will get to that soon. We just don't have enough data for Mythic yet. Not a lot of people that are doing the end bosses or close to end bosses are logging at the moment. Now, Beast Mastery is just there and it's solid. You will like its immunes, and you're probably going to get the Hunter utility kit from Beast Mastery before any other specs, because marksmanship is just, I guess we could probably put it into B tier. This was actually kind of surprising. Marksman has had way more boss damage than I expected, more so than a lot of other specs, which is why it's so high, because otherwise it would be down in C tier at the very least. And that's weird. Maybe it's because of the raid build, just puts you heavier into single target, but it is a spec that struggles with boss damage, period. So I was surprised to see it this high. I don't know if it's because it was flying under the radar, rather, if it's like a sleeper spec. A sleeper B tier spec is not very reassuring, to be fair anyway, but it's not as bad as people like it to think. And you will want hunters, like I mentioned. You want those immunes. Those are very good for a couple of the mechanics, but you'd probably still want that from a Beast Mastery Hunter. Definitely not from a Survival Hunter. Bro, I don't know where to put this. I think it's kind of bottom C tier. It's not much to say about Survival Hunter. It just needs buffs. Like in most of the data that we've seen for Survival, its damage output is just very low, comparably to anything other than it. Any other spec in the list. Listen, you get what I mean. And it doesn't really bring anything unique either. It's, as a melee DPS, you have almost every other melee that's better than it. As a hunter spec, you have definitely all the other two hunter specs that are better than it. You're not as mobile, you're not as immobile, and you're not as tanky either. So if I was a raid leader, I would be hard-pressed to find a reason to bring a survival instead of anything else in the game. Maybe you could bring it instead of a balance raid, but even that, I mean, I don't know, at least balance excels at Styx, which is a very strong boss, very big wall, let's say, for people to progress into the raid. Now, Arcane is kind of down bad as well. We've did last week a video on the Mythic Plus meta, and Arcane is kind of bad across the board. I don't know what's going on with Arcane, and to be fair, I don't think the devs know either, because I think its main problem is lack of identity or struggle to find its identity. It doesn't feel like the Arcane team that's handling Arcane knows what they want Arcane to be, and because of that, I don't think it is really anything. It's not a single target king, it's not an AoE king. They've been swapping its procs for about almost a year now. Do we want people to double dip into Nether Precision? Do we want Ether Vision? Oh, we take that away, we give it back. I don't know what's going on with Arcane, and because of that, I don't think its consistency can land in a point where after it's settled, it can also be tuned, because it doesn't have the damage. So, okay, let's say it would have an identity, it would still need buffs, but if you don't know what the spec is supposed to do, you don't really know what to buff, because if you just buff willy-nilly, you'll have it back in Nerebar Palace, where it was just like destroyed destroying everybody until it got nerfed into the ground and nobody could actually play it efficiently anymore. Of course, people play it. This is not the worst in the game, but it's no Fire Mage. And maybe to nobody's surprise, Fire Mage is our first S tier spec of the day, because finally Fire was buffed. Since Fire pretty much had all of the tools that it needed to be an S tier spec all along, it's always just a problem of damage. Fire has been changed a little bit since the first season, where you're a little bit less mobile now, which doesn't really seem to affect Fire whatsoever. And that's a great thing, because I was an ex-Fire Mage and I don't like the changes, but that's fine. Fire just is really good for the same reasons that it's really good in Mythic Plus as well. It's just a really good spec designed for modern World of Warcraft combat encounters. It has some of the highest single whenever it has good single target damage, or the best single target damage, is the best spec in the game, period, because it has easy access to cleave. Very efficient cleave where the damage can spread to other targets without losing almost any single target whatsoever. At most, you might lose maybe 1% single target damage, really, if you just play pure single target and just spread your ignite with fire blasts, and that's about it. And that's a very good trade-off, not something that you will find in specs like Beast Mashy or even Arcane Mage or even Frost DK or Devastation, right? So that's why our Fire is so high up, because it's just a matter of getting the numbers right. And not to mention that mages can do some really gnarly stuff this time around, bro. Like, I don't know if you guys have seen what Mythic Mugsy is supposed to be about, but a lot of people are looking forward to be able to do a lot of niche little things with Fire Mage in the later end stages of the raid, and that's probably why a lot of people are also playing it. And his damage is not that bad. It's actually kind of top tier. Frost Mage, not so much. It will go down into C tier. It's also an issue of damage. It's also an issue of, I think actually it's just damage. Because similar to Fire Mage, it does have some of the best single target. Last year it was the best single target mage spec in the game, mostly because it was tuned that way, but it also has kind of the right tools. It's not as good as Fire at having efficient single target that can also cleave to other targets, but with Splitting Ice, you're kind of always guaranteed to hit 2 targets, and that's always really good, because in fights where adds matter, it's usually 1 or 2 adds that really matter, unless you're like Styx Bunk Junker, which is, you know, have the bombshell. It's a lot of adds. But still, that's not enough to see it any higher. I mean, it could have the potential to be at least a B tier spec later into the season, once people discover more compositions, once people are more comfortable playing something other than Fire Mage. If you still need a mage, you're probably going to get a Frost Mage, and it's very likely, as with any ranking and any tier list, that the more good mages are playing Fire, the bigger the difference between Fire and Frost will be, since we don't have enough people playing Frost to begin with, and you don't have enough good mages playing Frost to push the spec a little bit higher. And now we come to the upset of this tier. For the first time in, God, I don't know how long, Windwalker is an S tier rank spec in the raid. Dude, I remember back when we used to do Battle for Azeroth tier lists for raids for monks and guides for Windwalkers, and everybody was talking about the fact that Windwalker has no good single target. Windwalker is never a good raid spec because it just doesn't mash well. And it finally happened. Can you imagine being somebody that plays Windwalker and having to wait 6 years for your spec to finally be a really good raid spec? How long, bro? I'm not saying you're gonna get nerfed. I really hope you're not gonna get nerfed, because it deserves its spotlight. It is the highest single target simming spec in the game currently, with the highest boss damage simming in the game currently. So it's looking like once everybody's geared, Windwalker is probably the best raid spec, period. It doesn't feel like it's the best by a lot, but it is the best by the same kind of amounts that Arcane was the best last year. A little bit less though. Arcane was ahead of the other specs a little bit more than Windwalker is, and Arcane got nerfed. Fury got nerfed. So specs in the position of Windwalker before were nerfed. I really hope this doesn't happen again, because it is kind of like the main selling points of Windwalkers, and they've been waiting for this moment for a long time. But that doesn't matter. Data is data. Well, what do people say? Facts don't care about your feelings. That is where Windwalker is at the moment. And there are a bunch of graphs that you can look at the moment right now to see that Windwalker is not always the best spec in the game, and it's not the best at all of the bosses. Obviously, some of the best things that it has going for it, I would know because I'm a main Windwalker. I don't know how I lucked out, but I lucked out, bro. Is that it's very mobile and decently tanky. It's not the tankiest spec in a game as people would like to see it, and rank it, it's okay, but it's in the bottom half than in the top half. So there's that. But the increase in mobility, which really helps on the hardest bosses in the raid, which are Styx Bunk Junker. You might see some of the footage of how we play Styx Bunk Junker, at least on Heroic. We're gonna get to Mythic eventually, and it's a really good spec that you can just do pretty much all the mechanics with. You're not affected by the mechanics or by the damage dealers as much as other people are, because you can just like blast through it. You have very good defensives, and that does a lot of good things for Windwalker. But those defenses were kind of always there. What changed is, well, they did buff the physical damage stacking defensive, but they just increased its damage, bro. That's all it took. Increased its damage, and part of the reason why it's kind of good across the board is that you have access to multiple builds that just really work with the encounter designs. And I can speak about it because obviously I'm a main. You have pure single target builds that do really good boss damage. You have cleave builds that still do really good damage and occasionally blast, burst, AoE damage, and they just seem to align with ad phases in the raid. So Windwalker, I do have to say, although it's seeming really high in single target, it also lucked out in the way that the raid encounters are this time around. I think if we take Windwalker the way it is now and put it into Nerebar Palace, it will probably still do some of the most boss damage, but it will not be as good across the board as it is right now, because it's just a different raid. So that also matters as well. Now, I could talk about Windwalker all day. We're going to move on to Ret Paladin. Okay, so normally on my little sheet here, I have red set pretty low, but I think this is a mistake. Normally I would have put it into C tier. I think I'm going to put it into B tier at the very least, for the same reasons as to why I've ranked Unholy so high. Red is just very solid across the board. You could say that in terms of early raid meta and raid progression, red is average. And that's not a bad place to be, considering that right now, people that are contributing to these logs and to these data sheets that you see are usually some of the best players in the game right now, because those would be the ones who are playing the game most right now and who are pushing their specs to the limits. Red is also one of the tankiest specs in the game, which definitely helps when it comes to progression, for once again the same reasons that I mentioned when I talked about the Death Knights, and particularly Unholy. You also have immunes, which Death Knight does not have, and that goes a long way into keeping Red afloat. Bubbles are so good this time around. Once again, particularly to Mugsy, where you have a lot of soaks, where you can immune those soaks. Having bubbles and having immunes in general is really good, and Divine Shield is probably the best one out of all of them in the game. I think it's the only immune where you can still damage during it, because I don't know if we consider Netherwalk and Cloak of Shadows pure immunes. Plus, you cannot continue your DPS rotation within Netherwalk anyway. So that's why I see Red as high. It doesn't have the highest amount of damage. It does have really good damage. You could maybe make an argument to put it bottom A tier, but you would be probably stretching it at that point. Shadow Priest, the resurgence, everybody. I don't remember Shadow Priest being that good in Nerebar Palace, but I think its damage has just been buffed. Nothing really extraordinary happened to Shadow Priest to make it good all of a sudden. There hasn't been any real rework that I know about. If anything, Void Weaver was kind of nerfed, if I recall. And the tier set doesn't really seem like it does anything. The tier set in overall, which I haven't mentioned up until now, they're pretty much bland across the board. They're all pretty much RNG and all pretty much passive. Nothing really changes about it. They just give you more damage. For certain specs, it might change it into giving a little bit more single target and a little bit more AoE, and that might affect their overall performance, but I'm not sure it does anything for Shadow in terms of overall performance outside of just boosting its damage. And that's where Shadow Priest is. If anything, Shadow Priest does have a downside of being extremely immobile on some fights where you really need a lot of mobility. However, it does have really good single target damage. It does have really good cleave damage, because obviously you can just cleave off of the one target with Psychic Link, and that makes for a really good rate tier. It's kind of like Fire Mage if it had less damage. So yeah, you could probably even put Shadow Priest at the bottom S tier, but I think is just not the same as Mage and Monk. Now, Assassination was a former contender for top melee dog. Now it's just kind of average as well. People don't really play a lot of Rogue this time around, but when they do, Assassination seems to be doing fairly okay. I don't really have a lot to say about this, because I don't think the race used that many rogues either. I struggle to remember any good rogues that were played there, and in the ranking so far, Assassination is just kind of average, or maybe slightly below average. It can have some of the best boss damage when you really focus on it, and it does have the Caustic Spatter cleave damage profile, which is really good if you really need it, but that's about I don't know if it's anything special, because to be fair, where I will maybe upset a lot of people is with Outlaw. And you might say upset, but not if you are an actual Outlaw spec, because for some reason I think Outlaw deserves to be top of the A tier specs. And once again, for the same reasons as to why Feral and Unholy are here. First of all, Outlaw is the third tankiest spec in a game, is this right? So that helps, of course. Outlaw has always been the tankiest rogue spec, period, and one of the tankiest melee DPS, period. So it's great that they still have that niche. But also you have really good damage, boss damage, and I think people are really sleeping on Outlaw on this particular thing. Not a lot of people just watch boss damage from specs, because if you look at overall damage performance, Outlaw is just, once again, kind of average, similar to Ret, but it does actually really excel at boss damage almost consistently on all of the hard bosses in the raid so far. You have immunities in Cloak of Shadow, but I don't think that counts so much. Plus, you're just really mobile with, I think you have access to both Shadow Step and Grappling Hook, right? They still have Shadow Step. These have been changed too much on rogue specs, and I've only played Subtlety so far. So, yay, I really hope that more people actually get to play Outlaw, because it has been kind of struggling this expansion. Subtlety is, I think, a little bit better, but it's better than it was in the first season, I think. But it's still a little bit average across the board. Subtlety, I think it's one of those specs where you either do really good single target or really good AoE damage. However, you pretty much always take Secret Technique, which is probably your best AoE damage source, and it's a burst AoE source. It kind of would be similar to how Windwalker has access to burst AoE, cleave every now and again, but it's probably just not enough damage across the board when it comes to just ranking Subtlety any higher. But to be fair, if you ask me, anybody that's in B tier and higher is a particular winner this time around. Anybody that's in S tier is just very niche and likely to not stay that way towards the end of the tier. Elemental is also around B tier-ish. Now, I was actually going to rank Elemental a little bit lower. It has quite a bit of damage, but once again, I feel like it's in a similar situation with Balanced Druid, and we've had this situation before where some of the damage that it has is, I don't want to call it pad damage, which is, you know, insignificant damage done to ads that's inconsequential to the progress of the fight. It does do some of the highest AoE damage, period, whenever stuff is particularly bunched up together. I can imagine Galliwix ads are an example of this. Sticks probably not as much, because ads are usually a little bit more spread out, which is why Balance excels there, not as much Elemental, but it is really good when AoE is in the raid. So if you are, let's say, an Elemental Shaman in a raid composition that has just very big single target pumpers, then you might be able to handle quite a lot of the ad phases on your own with the help of one or two other specs, so you're gonna do really fine. But whenever people will get enough gear to, you know, blast those ads without even thinking, I would probably see Elemental ranked a little bit lower. But on the sheer fact that Shaman is just a really good class altogether, I'm gonna leave Elemental around in B tier. And Enhancement is very surprisingly, bro, I don't know if I've ranked this right, bro. It just doesn't feel right. But hey, listen, I'm going with it. Enhancement is B tier. And it's weird because it has quite a bit of damage. It has decent boss damage. Maybe it's bad. Maybe I shouldn't put it here. Actually, I'm going to put it, let's say top of the B tier spec. So in terms of boss damage, it's above average, which is really good for Enhancement. I know for a fact that Enhancement kind of struggles a little bit at having a comprehensive build that does really good boss damage and cleave, where a lot of enhancements, for instance on Galliwix that I know of, because I know my buddy plays Enhancement as well, are just running pure single target damage builds for Galliwix, which obviously is really good, but also means that Enhancement's overall performance in terms of damage output is not gonna shine as much as other specs would, since you're kind of doing almost no AoE damage just to focus on doing more boss damage, which is something that I can totally respect. But in terms of the overall performance, is just above average across the board, and that's just where it is. There's not much to say about it. It's not the same situation as Nerbar. It had probably one of the best tier sets in Nerbar Palace, period, and this one is not as great anymore, and that definitely affects it. Plus, it received so many nerfs during PTR that I'm not surprised that it's B tier actually at all. It's still a very good spec. It is one of the few specs that are actually used in progress, more so than Elemental. We have a graph here from maybe Mythic's Procketmonger, where you can see that not a lot of specs are actually logged here, but you see that enhancement is outside of a lot of other specs that are maybe even A tier at the moment. So it's not that bad, but I do have to be consistent with the data, so I'm gonna just leave enhancement into B tier. Now, Affliction is a surprise. Affliction is A tier. Now, I don't know if I should put it in front or behind Feral. I think probably in front, because a lot of the damage graphs that you might see on the screen right now in terms of the overall output of Affliction kind of sees it as an S tier level spec. It has possibly the highest damage out of all the other DPSers with the exception of Windwalker and Fire Mage. And that's really good because Affliction hasn't really been top of anything for a very long time. I think the last time Affliction was a really good raid spec was either early Nathria or Battle for Azeroth. Ever since then, I feel like it slowly trailed off into the distance, into the unknown, in the sunset. So it's great that it's back again, as back as A tier is, and A tier is probably as back as anything will ever be back. So that's great for Affliction. Not much else I can say. You're always going to want a Warlock in your raid. You're always going to need gates, and you're always going to need Hellstones, of course, and Affliction is probably your best bet to bring those, although there are fights where other Warlock specs will shine a little bit more. Not as much with Demonology. I feel like Demonology is the worst performing Warlock spec this season, probably, period, because it just doesn't bring anything unique, and Demonology is just one of those specs where it just has to do a lot of damage to be really good. Affliction just has spread dot damage, if you can play it that way, and really efficient single target damage, and Destro, which we'll get into a second, has different kind of utility kits that Demo just doesn't do. Demo is just very standard. It doesn't have a unique niche, so all it can do is do a lot of damage if it ever gets to that point. And speaking of Destro, I think I'm gonna put it somewhere around top B tier. Let's say I want to put it next to Enhancement because Chaos Bolt Cleave is really good, of course, for a lot of the bosses with ads, for a lot of the dangerous ads that come about, and it does start to excel a lot, especially on fights like One Arm Bandit. It's not a particularly difficult fight of the raid, which is probably why you won't see any particular graphs here, because it's not that important, but it is something where Destruction can scale. We've seen Race World First guilds use Destruction on Mugsy, for instance, and that's a good boss to try it out, so that's kind of why it's there. It's not quite A tier. I don't think it has the damage potential of Affliction, but it definitely has at least a niche, which is more than we can say about Demonology. Now, Arms, I think, is also a kind of a sleeper spec. We have a lot of Arms in our guild, and they are fucking shit up right now, bro. And it has most to do with executes. Dude, whenever we get to that execute phase, I am done, bro. There's nothing I can do to Arms Warrior. And that's great. That's a really amazing niche to have, because it kind of always was Warrior's niche, particularly Arms, and I think it should be, because it's good to be good at something. They're also really good for cleave fights, of course, whenever ads are stacked, because you have access to so much sweeping strike uptime because of the new rework, and much to my chagrin. But I digress. And the Blazestorm Burst on ad phases on, I don't know, Gallywix is really good, One Arm Bandit is really good, Styx is really good. I don't know how Arms Warrior times their Blazestorms. You probably don't want to hold Blazestorm, so if it matches with the cadence of the ad spawns, it's probably going to be a really, really good spec all around. Not as much that I can say about Fury Warrior. Fury Warrior, I think I kind of ranked it bottom B tier. Jesus. Bottom B tier? Damn. Alright. Well, bottom B tier it is. I think Arms is just better. Fury Warrior is either really good at explosive AoE burst, which it was in Erebar Palace before it got nerfed into the ground, but it has struggled with boss damage, period, ever since it's nerfed. And it's kind of in a similar situation with Balanced Druid, unless it gets like some changes to its damage profile. And I think Warrior in general just needs a rework, period. It might not shine at boss damage unless they just give you another tier set with like Bloodthirst doing more damage than Execute that we had back in Dragonflight, which obviously is not the case right now. But outside of those really niche situations that actually paint a picture as to what the probably main issue with Fury would be, in my opinion, you're not gonna be that great. And listen, B tier is not that bad, right? You're average performance, bottom half of the DPS pool, but still average. Now, oh, how the mighty have fallen. Well, I kind of want to put it into D tier, but I don't know if it's as bad. In terms of overall performance, we cannot really judge Augmentation almost ever because it definitely has the least amount of damage out of all of the DPS specs in the raid. And I think it would have been better when we could look at Augmentation's overall damage output and include the damage that it buffs from other specs, because otherwise we just don't really know, considering that it's unique utility that kept people alive and not that much in raids as you would in dungeons, but that's no longer there as much anymore or almost at all. So I think it's just a dead spec. I think the devs really just don't want people to play Augmentation because either they don't know how to make it work properly or they're probably in a reworking phase when it comes to getting Augmentation to actually function as a functional spec in the game. To be fair, I'm kind of happy that that's the case. I kind of want to see Devastation a little bit more because I don't think we ever seen proper Devastation Evokers ever since the class was released. Since in terms of like meta distribution, whether it is in raids and Mythic Plus, it has always been either preservation or augmentation. So it had its time in the spotlight for, oh dear God, 4 seasons. So it can take a little bit of a break, although I'm never a fan of, you know, telling people you cannot play your spec anymore. That's just terrible. And unfortunately, you might not see any difference between this one and the Mythic Plus meta when it comes to augmentation, but you might find some more interesting things in our first interaction with the meta in Mythic Plus that we did a video on last week, which you can check and click right here. And we would super appreciate if you like and subscribe these videos. Love you all. See you next time. Bye-bye.